So today I'm here talking to Stephen Ramm, my energy expert. So people often say to me, how do you know this deep thought about lots of these things? Well, I don't think about it myself necessarily. I've just got lots of really clever people I speak to. And Stephen's the man I speak to about energy, anything around that I can get his advice. I think he gets a bit bored of me sometimes ringing him up, asking him loads of random questions, very specific questions, quite technical questions. So Stephen, tell me about what you do.
So I've been working in energy, I guess, all my life. In some ways, I originally worked for a manufacturing company in Norwich, Heat Ray Sadia, and went through plumbing and electrical apprenticeships, and then got involved in their R&D and things, and kind of moved on from there. Moved into renewables in the early 2000s, sort of fell into it in some ways, kind of looking for a bit of a career change as Heat Ray kind of changed. And sort of enjoyed it and loved the way the industry moves and kept sort of adapting and moving them to different technologies and things. So I work mainly as an energy consultant, which is a job that I have great fun at. And it's fantastic because I have people like yourselves that often think of energy quite differently, and have puzzles and problems that they want to solve. And I very much enjoy taking the different elements of that and trying to put it together. And it changes so quickly. There are always things sort of changing within the industry itself, or problems or difficulties. And it's that aspect I very much like. It's not very stagnant. It moves very fast.
Yeah, do you think that the change has speeded up over time, or has it always been evolving quite quickly?
I think for many years, energy sort of sat in the background in some ways. It was a bit of a kind of, a number on a balance sheet, but after the energy crisis hit, that accelerated things phenomenally. I think people become much, much more aware of their energy and really wanted to have more of a conversation around what could be done. But sort of, from the early 2000s onwards, we were seeing people starting to try and adopt renewables. They're a bit more aware of climate change. And obviously the government were trying to steer people in that direction with, legislation and things as well. But I do feel like the pace seems to continuously increase. And we're faced with new problems and new challenges as we all adapt to, a different energy landscape.
Yeah, I think we first met through you being our energy broker. Would that be the right terminology?
Yeah.
So how I think about it in very basic terms is I haven't got the headspace to think about who I'm going to buy power from. I sat down with you, explained what we were trying to achieve, and then you go to the market and speak to... Do you actually speak to them all? I don't actually know how that process works.
Yeah, so absolutely. Right at the beginning, the very most important thing is to understand what you need on what you require from your energy needs. So we kind of go through a bit of a process of, getting to know your client, sort of a few tick boxes, things that you require. For instance, you were very, very adamant at the beginning. You wanted renewable energy, you wanted green power and things because it was important to the business. So, we'll take all that information then. We'll also kind of add in some of our expertise and perhaps do a bit of a sense check for some of the things to begin with, making sure that your billing's correct, that your metering's all sorted, things like that. Then we'll go out and we'll email that information out to typically certain suppliers that we feel would be advantageous or would be quite, would look at your sites quite favourably, provide a competitive price. We collect all the information together, do a lot of sense checking ourselves before we then present that to you, and we'll give you a kind of list of options with some guidance of what we think would be best. But then ultimately, you sort of have the final to say in what you want to do, because, we'll do everything we can to try and know you as a client, as a business, but ultimately it's still your decision at the end. And occasionally you'll get thrown a bit of a curveball and you might present something to someone and go, right, this is the cheapest price. This is, what you can go for. This ticks everything. But then they've had a bad experience with that supplier in the past, maybe, so we might move on to the next person in the list.
Because it always seems it's quite data driven. You always require the half hourly data, because most of your clients, I'm assuming, are industrial clients that are on half hourly billing. And tell me if I'm wrong, how I think about it is like our meter is taking a reading every half an hour of the power that we've used. So it's much more granular in the information, and you will then, I know that we have to give you access to that, and then you use that as part of the process.
Absolutely right, yeah. And the more data we have, the better. Suppliers typically look for a year's half-hourly data.
Yeah.
You're right, a lot of the larger clients we have will have that access to data, but we're starting to see that granularity sort of filter through to sort of smaller users as well, with the rollout of smart metering.
So smart metering in a home actually is more granular than our industrial meter, isn't it? I think with is that every 5?
It varies a little bit, but yes, it can be more granular, but the industry doesn't necessarily use that for settlement.
Oh, so
That is changing.
I'm looking on the app going, oh, I've used that much power in the last 5 minutes. They don't really care about that. They still work in...
Some of them do. Octopus, for example,
Yeah.
they do time of use tariffs and things, so at certain times of the day they can be quite granular with their usage. But other non-half hourly sites, they're not. The data is sort of there in the background, but it's not necessarily used for settlement. But we are seeing that change. They're rolling out market-wide half-hourly settlement in the next sort of year or two, so that literally every meter in the system will be used to there'll be sort of much more granular settlement on that information.
Across everything. But how will that affect... That's like a system thing. How does that affect like me as an industrial user or a home user? Will we actually... we won't see a lot from that. That's more of a back-end thing.
Yes, I think, yeah. I think we're going to see some of the changes and see how that affects the industry. It will allow them to probably price and to probably cater for volumes a little differently and things. Again, there are some forward companies already doing so, and it will allow access to more time of use tariffs, things like that, where you can actually get cheaper power at certain times of the day. Across the system we see sometimes, and that's what sort of some suppliers will do, and that's kind of negative pricing almost.
Yeah.
That's almost paying you to
Octopus
take energy.
I've had that. I use Octopus at home. It's quite a good system.
Yeah.
And you'll get a notification in the next hour. You can use as much power as you like, and it's free.
Yeah.
Or we might pay you to use it because there's excess. And
Exactly.
I think they're trying to test what happens when they do that. And I was part of a few tests when there was a constraint on the grid, and they asked you to use as minimum amount of power.
Yeah.
And I think it turned out actually it had quite a impact.
Demand shifting, yeah. So they're sort of saying, we'll actually take a load off the system at certain times to try and help the system out effectively, because we're dealing with infrastructure that was built many years ago, and we're all trying to demand different things from it. And whereas everything was kind of centralized generation beforehand, we've moved to much more decentralized energy now.
Yeah.
So you've got two quite large arrays on the buildings, on the factories here.
So I have about 600 kilowatts with 500 kilowatts of inversion, and then 200 plus kilowatts with 200 kilowatts of inversion. So that's what I'm capable of producing. But so you then have to also deal with selling the excess for me as well, which is a separate contract.
Absolutely.
I think.
Yeah, absolutely right. So the selling of power back to the system, we put a separate contract in place for that. And that will be with different suppliers. So you can effectively split those apart. You can have your import and your export. It's not often that favourable to kind of join those together.
I think we've now, because we have two sites, we've got the Brickfield site, the Fice and Way site, and we've got export on both. I think working with you, we've now, and this will probably become relevant later on in our conversation, that we've now aligned the renewal dates of both sites. Import and export are all the same date now, aren't they? We did some work with you, so that now potentially in the future that could be beneficial for us to have that alignment of import export across two sites.
Absolutely, yeah. And it takes a little bit of work sometimes to do that, to get them aligned, because certain suppliers only prefer certain contract lengths and bits and pieces, but it does make it administratively a bit easier. But also, it'll, it opens up potential.
Administrate, that's the important, like you said, these curveballs, like Becky Mason, my finance director, she gets really upset if, it might be the cheapest price, but if their billing's awful, you start getting all sorts of, I know we experimented with splitting the tariff up.
Yeah, like a pass-through
Talk
contract.
briefly about that,
Yeah.
and I got a lot of grief about that. I had a very unhappy finance director. I thought this seems like a great idea, and Stephen facilitated that. I got a lot of hassle for that.
Yeah, I mean it's tricky. So if you're starting to look at energy a bit differently, and if you have the opportunity to potentially load shift and move some of your energy usage around your consumption, then there are types of contracts out there that will kind of allow you to expose more of those contract rates.
Is that because I think lots of people don't realise is the rate, if I'm paying 21p for my power, it's only a third or 40% of that is actually the power.
Yep.
It's not, tell us about that, how it's...
So if you broke it down, I think there's something like 20, there's 20 plus different elements to an energy bill, plus then the wholesale costs that kind of gets popped on top. You've got distribution costs, you've got national grid costs, you've got sort of effectively what are green levies to help support the rollout of new technologies and things.
So some of those green levies were where we had feed-in tariffs for solar years ago, which aren't around anymore. They're still paying out and we're still paying on our bill for those things.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So feed-in tariffs. There is support now for the nuclear industry. There's even little things like support for Scotland. All the very, very small sites that are out there that take a lot of cost to really run the energy out to them.
Yeah.
So there are many, many different elements to that that constitute a bill. And you're right, it's about 40, probably getting on for more like 50% of the bill now, because of
50% is the wholesale and 50% of these distribution levies.
Yep.
And obviously we've got to pay for distribution. Someone's got to pay for all those wires that bring the power here and people going up on the cables, maintaining things, transformers.
Absolutely right.
There's a cost.
Yeah.
And and I say we, as in Warren is probably, part of the problem in a way, where the transformers generally, you've got high voltage electric, 400,000 volts on transmission, and then it feeds us at 11,000 volts, and these transformers were designed to go one way originally, so you had 11,000 down to 415, which I need to use, but now I'm creating solar and pushing it back through the so do some of those transformers not really like that?
Absolutely, yeah. So some of the experiences I think that we went through, during when you were having the solar installed previously, and some of the conversations sort of following that has been around constraints and what what we can feed back onto the system. UKPN, one of the better kind of DNOs to work with.
Are they?
Yeah, they are.
See, I always moan. I had a call with Make UK yesterday about grid connections, and I said, it's just a nightmare. It's a bit of a shit show, to be honest, sometimes with and they just give you this 200 kilowatt export agreement across every bill, wherever you are. Yeah. And this is UKPN is our area. We're in the east of England. Yeah. And I'm like, but I want to do more. And what I want to make very clear is when you talk to the actual people, they're great.
Yeah.
I just don't think there's enough of them.
Yeah.
They're just swimming in too much work, drowning in work. And you just have to get to the top of the list somehow. And eventually I had 500 kilowatt of possible export here. We then got them to agree to give us 400 kilowatt after 18 months of backwards and forwards. Ollie Taylor was very busy at Ivy Solar.
Yeah, I bet.
We'll have to talk to him one day, actually. And then I had to put export limitation equipment on my solar, so I could only ever export 400. It doesn't actually cause a massive problem, but that's...
See, they've had to transfer from being, providing energy to, as you say, a kind of transfer across the system. They've effectively changed from a distribution network operator to a service provider, so a service operator now. I can't remember what the acronym they've changed to, but they've had to change dramatically over the last few years. If we went back 10 years, perhaps slightly more than that, but these things were quite new, and they applying for export connections and things like that was all sort of all a bit sort of strange.
I suppose they were used to me ringing up going, I want more power, not I want to pump power back on. Well, we haven't got a department for that.
Yeah.
Is that even possible?
Yeah.
So obviously these transformers can allow that to work, but they're not really optimized for that. And is that what they're sort of concerned about? Sometimes they don't want too much solar on the grid because that will just cause problems, but they're also trying to protect their infrastructure a bit.
Absolutely right. And as I understand it, a lot of it is around sort of thermal constraints and things, because the transformers are rated to provide, to step down to provide power to yourselves, to step it back up. Then they're whatever's in position was designed to do that job beforehand.
Yeah.
And
even though it works,
equipment.
they don't really. No one's done loads of testing on that, so they're like, if you had a brand new super duper bi-directional transformer, it'd be fine. Yeah. But we're using kit that's legacy.
Yeah, ultimately you could have any export connection you wanted, but UKPN would present you with a bill kind of going, yeah, well, we can do that, but we'll have to upgrade the transformer and then potentially the lines up to the next part of the system, up to 33 kV lines, whatever, and it becomes pretty costly, and then they adopt it. So you never, that you're almost sort of upgrading the infrastructure for them. So that's where the limitations are sometimes.
We obviously had that massive energy spike with the starting of the war in Ukraine. What was that like for you?
For me, it was pretty scary time because I'd literally left full-time work.
So for me, I was like, my energy bill could go up like three times.
It was crazy and really stressful because, when you deal with clients, when you're having to present prices to them that are just astronomical, but there's nothing.
What was the worst case where you saw from what they were paying before to a new contract?
We saw somebody that moved from about 17, 18p to nearly £1 per kilowatt hour.
And were they using much power?
It was a reasonable amount. I mean, it was enough to cause some serious problems. We dealt with a couple of schools that had some real difficulties. And we dealt with a portfolio of leasehold properties, and seeing them go from about 15p up to about 80p, and then how that knocked on to kind of the service charges and things. It was really hard time, really stressful, because again you're sort of presenting that, and you sort of partly feel responsible.
And you've worked with these clients for years.
Yeah, some of them, yeah.
And all of a sudden you're dishing that one up. Normally you're going, oh, look, I've negotiated really hard and it's gone up a little bit, or we've got a bit of a reduction. Yep. All of a sudden you're going, oh, it was 20p, it's now it's 4 times as expensive.
Yeah, it was horrific, So there was suppliers just wouldn't price because they didn't know what the risk was going to be like. So, you would...
Did some go out? I'm trying to think back. Some went bust, didn't they?
Yeah, we had a big problem within the industry because of liquidity and things. So there were a lot of suppliers that kind of just went by the sidelines.
So what happens then? This didn't happen to me, but I got, say, a 3-year contract, 20p a unit, and after a year we have the Ukraine thing. They're not stable enough as a company. They go bust. I've got no contract. There's no. It's not like the government back the banking system. That's just a bad luck.
It is, yeah. Ofgem would appoint a supplier of last resort or someone else, to step in.
But they don't have to provide at that cost.
No.
They have to provide power, but they would go, look, it's now 60p.
Yeah, I'm very sorry, but, that's the state of things, and, and it is difficult.
And that happened?
Yeah.
Did that happen to any of your clients?
No, fortunately not. We, I think through...
Is that because you selected the right...
I'll say there's a fair proportion of judgment, maybe a little bit of luck as well, but we sort of dealt with
it's always
companies
good to have some luck.
Yeah, but you had to take a view and be a bit careful about the companies you were dealing with. There was a lot on the domestic side that caused problems, but on the business side, we sort of stuck with the big companies.
But I suppose on the domestic side, the government then brought in the energy or cap or whatever it was called, which then protected consumers to a certain extent, where industry wouldn't have that.
No, absolutely not. No, there was obviously a system that they put in through COVID and that lot to sort of help with pricing and things, but ultimately, there was not quite the same protection there.
So is this a bit like when you choose an insurance company? It's no good going, Bill and Ben Insurance, that's really, really cheap. But then when you come to claim, they're not there, or there's a million terms and conditions. So choosing the right energy provider is as important, because it's becoming more and more of an important part of the cost stack of a business, particularly if you're in an energy intensive industry, which a lot of people I work with in manufacturing, we use a lot of power.
Yeah. And it does, you're absolutely right. It's down to those companies, and also terms and conditions, and you present them. And that's part of what we do again, is to kind of look through those terms and kind of go, okay, how does this work for the business? A prime example, we won't go into too much detail, but there are suppliers out there that will present a contract and fix a rate, but they'll make the terms and conditions quite woolly so that they can open up the contract at some point if certain things change. A recent change is National Grid have asked Ofgem if they can increase their charges, what they levy against energy bills by they want to increase them by about 97%. Now Ofgem have gone through that and reduced that by a certain amount. But there are energy suppliers out there that, although it's a fixed contract, will open that book up again and go, actually, no, we need to increase your costs.
And that's National Grid because they need to reinforce the grid. There's a cost.
Yep.
I did hear something the other day, though. They were saying that they would have to charge more money, but then that would reduce the cost of, what's it called, curtailment. So there's another bit of the bill that pays for curtailment, that actually if we reinforce the grid, the cost of curtailment might go down. So is there a sort of cost and plus and minus on both sides? Or
I think at the moment it's probably going to mostly just be a cost, I think, for the next few years.
I was hoping that maybe there might be a minus.
I think there's just so much work, so much infrastructure that needs upgrading and changing. You know that I mean they're undertaking the biggest sort of build out in generations. You know, National Grid, because we are rolling out large scale solar, wind, now potentially onshore wind. You know, we've got massive amounts of demand through data centers and things like that across the country.
Where we've been seeing, when you look at the data over the last sort of 15 years, our electric power use has gone down, hasn't it? With more efficient, it's more expensive, so people are more mindful of it. LED lighting, that's made quite a dent. But now all of a sudden we're getting more electric heating, more electric vehicles, data centers. That is then going to increase.
Yeah,
I think the electric car thing's interesting. I think that'll actually maybe potentially help the grid, because most people only need to charge their car maybe once a week. I do a lot of miles, so I have to charge more often. But then if you charge intelligently and go, well, actually, we've got limited resources, we won't charge today. If there's that flexibility, maybe that'll help.
I think it should do, you know, allow the grid to be more flexible. You can sort of set, and naturally there's price drivers there as well. You can charge your car at night. It should be cheaper depending on the
I do 7.5p Octopus. You know, it's brilliant. Exactly. It brings the cost of running an electric vehicle down.
And that's when there's surplus on the grid and things. So, you know, it should help the system. It's just allowing for that capacity and things. And, you know, again, dealing with DNOs, UK Power Networks, and kind of going, this is what I want to do at home. You know, is my fuse up to rating? You know, there are aspects to it that cause difficulties, but, you know, ultimately should allow some flexibility long term. And then you've got all the discussions around vehicle to grid, you know, how you could actually use your battery to support and feed power back when required.
Which is super exciting. Yeah, and, you know, and people having solar and battery, and then coming onto that, and more of your clients like us adopting self-generation of putting solar on their actual buildings if they've got the ability to do that.
Absolutely. And it's such an easy win for anybody that's got a bit of roof space. You know, if they've got reasonable demand, providing that, you know, that they're not using phenomenal amounts of power at night and very little during the day and things like that. As long as,
and that's unusual anyway, isn't it? The majority of people work during the daytime, so you use more power during the daytime.
Yeah, mostly that's it. But as long as you sort of sense check things a little bit, you know, it is pretty much an easy win, and you're effectively, you know, you're buying power now. You're investing in something that's going to then create energy and feed energy into your system for, you know, the next 20 or 30 years.
Well, I think I looked at the data from ours, and ours has paid for itself over 4 years. And then basically you're just generating power, not for free, because there is a little bit of maintenance costs and like that. And I think that's what people need to understand, is like there is an ongoing cost, but it's fairly small compared to what it generates.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think you can then, that is proper green power, because we'll circle back to what you said at the start, is I want to have all renewable power, but that word is very loose, isn't it? When I do my carbon accounting, even though I buy renewable power, I have to account for that power at grid carbon content. So if the carbon content of the grid of 2025 is 95 grams per kilowatt hour, whatever the number is, I can't remember, that's what I have to do, because I can't prove that it matched up, but obviously everything I self-generate just comes off my bill. So that's a much easier way. I know massive companies can do PPAs and guarantee a chunk out, but obviously for smaller companies, that's harder. But we do see that continuous greening of the electrical grid, don't we? Like year by year, it's just getting better.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, much less. I mean, obviously, we've seen coal drop off the bars off the system now. We're seeing gas, you know, reduce in some ways. There will always be, I think, a need for it because we need that inertia. We need, you know, fast response generation to kind of plug those gaps. But you're right. You know, although you may have a source of renewable energy that is green from whatever provider, your actual physical electrons on the system could come from various sources, and I think it's quite wise to kind of factor in for some of that. And although I sort of veer away from the carbon reporting side a little bit, you know, we have to sort of be mindful of that when we sort of talk to people and things. But having your own behind the meter generation, you can guarantee that that is absolutely your energy. You can track it, that you can, you know, you've got meters. I know you've got quite sophisticated monitoring equipment on your system.
Yeah, we use solar log, so we can see what we're generating on both sites, what our incoming is, where any gaps are. We actually use that also. It's quite handy to look at, well, why are we using that power at night, or why are we using that power at the weekend? So we used it as like a bit of a fault finding tool, and we discovered we were heating a container outside our like flammable paint when we should have been cooling it, or we were cooling it and heating it the same. And you're like, well, we would have never necessarily known that because it was always the right temperature, but we had a problem with two things being turned on at once. And we were like, well, what's going on there? And it highlighted it straight away. Also, our Ivy Solar that look after the solar, they monitor that all the time and say, oh, we can see there's an issue with this, and you know, they can look at degradation and if we need to clean the panels. Luckily, we've never actually cleaned the panels. You know, we get enough rain. Good thing about being in the UK. You know, we get enough rain that cleans the panels, and we've done like degradation check. Look, it gets the nominal value we should be producing to what we produce. But that's what a new thing we were talking about the other day. We overproduce at Brickfields. We overproduce a little bit at Fyson Way, but we quite easily, if we could send some power from Brickfields to Fyson Way, it'd be great. But up till now, it's been very, very difficult. It would be okay if I was Google and I had a massive solar farm somewhere and you can do all the contractual stuff and it's worth it. But it was too complex, wasn't it, for a small producer where I'm just talking about a few hundred kilowatts or megawatts between the two sites. The distance is too far to me to dig up the road. Well, yeah, I could, but the ideal would have my own cable, but that's difficult. But we talked about this, about trading between factories, and then you spoke to me the other day and said, actually, we might have a solution.
Yeah. So I think right from the very beginning, or for many years when we started to sell export onto the grid, it's been a bit of a kind of a bit of a thing where you kind of go, well, actually, you know, this power is entering the system at site A and it's being used at site B. You know, those two things should just be able to link. There's a paperwork exercise there that can prove that the grid has been kept balanced by that. And you know, we've tried through a few different means to sort of try and do that through different suppliers, through a few different mechanisms, but the industry has now started to catch up. There were a few grid reforms that were submitted a couple of years ago by some forward-thinking suppliers.
It's actually driven by the suppliers.
There are a couple of suppliers that have actually driven that those code modifications, and it's two particular ones. Getting nerdy, it's P441 and P442, and those modifications allow the industry to kind of look at and to treat those sites a little differently.
And do they have to be close, or does it not matter?
No, they can be across ideally, the closer the better, because you're not then, you know, the further you go, the more distribution costs you're expected to pay between the sites. But effectively, if you can prove that site A is generating power and pushing it onto the grid, and site B is using power and taking from the grid, and those match, or even a percentage of them match, you can then show that that power is your own. and then you can avoid certain industry charges, and effectively you can actually avoid the wholesale market because you're not having to buy that energy.
Yeah,
That is
I'm
your
selling
rate.
my own energy to myself, but
Yeah.
I'm using the grid. So I've got to pay a fee
Yep.
because someone's paid for all those cables,
Yeah.
and I'm using the cable. But that cost is variable on how much of the distribution or transmission you're using. Where if I'm selling it from here to up the road, that's only distribution.
Yeah.
Where if I was getting it from Scotland, it would also have to include transmission. So I can minimise.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. So this is all starting to develop now. And it's effectively you'll hear it described as energy clubs, or we describe it as peer-to-peer sleeving.
So was this why we started looking at aligning the two contracts on the two sites and the buy and sell contracts, because we've now got a bundle?
Yes, yep,
Right.
absolutely right. However we do it, we would need to align the supplier because we need to make sure that we can bill it, we can still satisfy the industry, that we're taking care of the billing aspect of things, that everything is above board. And those guys are the ones that still apply and pay the relevant charges that would still be applicable to the sites. But having them all lined up means now we can actually go out to market and go, right, we've got a supply here, but actually if we if we put those together, the actual net generation, the net demand is X and X, and then we only need to buy the surplus from the grid, and then you're only buying that extra bit.
But the supplier, so the energy company, do all that for us.
Yes.
So at the moment, they look at my bill and go, oh, we'll look at the half-hourly bill. Will is obviously producing solar in the summer, so I'm not going to have to buy any energy in the summer.
Yep.
So they work all that out, and then they give me a price.
Yep.
Now they've just got some other factors. They're also going, oh, we could sell from one site to the other. We'll maximise all of that, and then we need to backfill.
That's it.
And that seems quite complicated, but I don't need to worry about that.
No, you don't need to worry about that. The supplier does a lot of the matching, or we do a lot of the matching as well. So on a private market basis, if we can actually involve you in our own private market, so if you had a couple of sites and that matched very well with a couple of others, we can kind of even bring those together.
So we're looking at installing a battery. Is that going to be good for the energy provider, because I can then potentially change my profile again? Or
it ultimately comes down to data. I think what we'd have to do is probably gather a certain amount, install it for a year, or come back to it in a year's time when we've got available data for it, and then we'd put it out there, see how it affects your shape, and it could help, because if we help take it out of peak times and things like that.
So is there still a thing that, like, the grid is, they always say between like 5 and 7. So if you could say, right, actually, I'm going to always make sure we're not taking any power between 5 and 7. When you submitted my half-hourly data, they'd go, oh, there's no 5 and 7. That's good. But would they want some guarantee around that to give you a really...
And that's a problem, isn't it?
Right.
There's always a little bit of risk there that, although it is kind of working in this way, that, it may slip, or you may have a situation where you need to run power differently within the factory. I think you mentioned earlier that, you've got effectively a day and a night rate, and there's a little bit of difference between the two, but not huge amounts, because it's sort of a blended rate. There is more kind of going on with the energy bill, but you don't always see that. And don't tell Becky, but there is always the option in the future to go back to like a pass-through contract.
Right. I thought it was great.
And then you expose some of those other rates, some of the things that UKPN charge, a kind of time, use of system charges, where, in this area, it's about sort of, I think from memory, about 6 or 7p for on top of the bill to use a power between 4 and 7, because that's when that's
right.
when the
So actually taking myself off grid between 4 and 7 could potentially, but then you've got I've got to be able to guarantee that, otherwise I'd get whacked with a really big bill. I
mean, you don't have to guarantee it. It's just taking use out of those time periods, a bit like Octopus do on a domestic scale.
Yeah, that half-hourly, you can have the what's it called, Octopus Agile tariff, where you get a different price every half an hour, notified 24 hours in advance, which
Yep. So they're playing on the actual market itself, depending on, you know, the intraday kind of energy market. The use of system charges that the D&O sort of state, they are fixed. So between the hours of, you say, like 4 and 7, power is very expensive because we all head home, we bung the oven on.
So it's always they're irrelevant of the wholesale power market. If you can stop using power in that window, that's going to reduce your cost quite considerably.
And if you're on the sort of contract that reflects that,
yes,
you know, because
if you're not, it won't make any difference.
That's right.
Because I've always thought, you look around the estate here, there's lots of metal roofs. It's the cheapest place to base solar, and then we've got people putting that solar on their houses, which is probably 3 times as expensive.
Yeah, very likely.
But it made sense on a house because you're saving the 24p, and I'm only being able to sell my power for 8p. But if we stitched, say Thetford, we're in Thetford, you know, together, you could say, well, actually, it's stupid putting it on houses. Let's fill up all the industrial estates and then do this brokering. Is that something you think may happen in the future?
Yeah.
Even to domestic?
I think there are pilot schemes now that are running to do on the smaller scale. I read an article recently for, I think, one up in Yorkshire, and they're doing one on a domestic scale. The savings are, you know, slightly different because obviously you can do at scale for a business, you can do large installations, the cost of the solar is then a little bit less, you know, but we're starting to see it, you know, either on a domestic and a business scale.
You've just got to have an energy company that's willing to want to work in that slightly more complex way. They're not just buying on wholesale, selling to the customer and getting their little bit in the middle. This is more complicated, but I suppose it's becoming more digital.
It is, they're having to match power, and they're having to take a view on risk as well, because ultimately as well, they've still got to supply power to you, whether it does come from your alternative site or not, you know, so they've got to backfill it. Yeah, exactly.
You know? So they've got to have that, they've got that variable generation that they've got to then match with. And not just energy sort of, not just working in a collaborative way from that point of view, but we're also seeing now clients where they are putting solar installations on large buildings and then actually selling power to tenants. You know, and they can actually make the system a little bit more profitable, increase the ROIs, and the tenant still gets, you know, slightly reduced power and stuff. You know, so there are several ways to kind of structure it. Because I'm thinking back to when what you said at the start, and I hadn't really pushed on it, is I didn't realise when we started working together that, well, I sort of did realise, but that the reading of the meters and it's all done separately in industry, isn't it? We pay
meter operators.
MOPs. Is that MOP?
Yeah.
So I pay someone to read my meter, and that goes into a system, and then I buy, and they're completely independent. I think you did some optimization around that, wasn't it? Making sure we were with the right.
It's because it's a requirement of the industry. You never really own your meter. It either belongs to the supplier or a separate company. So when we set up your initial supply contract, I think mentioned earlier that we sort of sense check things a little bit. So we'll go through some initial steps, and one of them is to make sure that you're either got your own MOP agreement in place, or that you have a supplier that's got what's called a default MOP there for you. Default MOP charges are always more expensive, so we always try and separate that out. And another reason for separating it out is because it gives us control. If the supplier is appointing their own MOP, their own meter operator, the supplier pulls the data, and we don't necessarily have such easy access to it. And when I get geeky about data, and we've sort of had conversations in the past, the more data the better. It's great to have that control ourselves. So where we've worked through things before, we'll highlight that, you know, maybe you've got a MOP you don't even realise, and then you might already be paying default MOP charges.
So you could be paying twice. So
absolutely.
You can make some decent savings there, and those MOP, they could be charging whatever they like for that. And obviously when you go out to market for a new energy contract, you want that data accessible, which whoever's doing it, they're meant to give it to you, but it can be very difficult or very easy. We have like an online portal now, don't we? The company that we use, so you can look at it whenever you like, and you can get information.
And to further complicate things, you then have data collectors. They could be separate or the same as a meter operator. So you'll have one company that owns a meter. You'll have one company that's responsible for dialing into the meter and collecting the data and sending it to the supplier. You know, so there are several aspects to even that side of the business.
So there's a MOP and then the data people. Ours Ours are paired together,
Yes,
aren't
they
they?
are. Yeah, to sort of keep that simple, and as well, you can have a separate mop on your import and your export.
Yep.
You know, but ideally you should have those together and sort of matched and things. So there is, you know, there is some complications even on that side of things. And if you get it wrong, it can be a real headache. We've got a site up in Yorkshire at the moment where we've been trying to get an export meter fitted for about the last 2 years. You know, because it's problems with the mop not dealing with the supplier, and then we go back and then for some reason the mop's been de-appointed again and things like that.
Yeah.
So all these things kind of, these wheels turn in the background.
This is why we need someone like you. We need Steve and Ramm.
Trying to keep an eye on
Yeah,
it.
because ultimately we're just trying to make things. We're we're a manufacturing company, and I'm quite interested in it, but it is complicated. But I think we are moving in the right direction.
Absolutely.
So,
and you do need to keep an eye on it and keep monitoring it. And we'll have regular sense checks. We'll have, because you and I have conversations quite a lot anyway, like you say, about bouncing different ideas around, which is always brilliant. But you know, you do need to keep an eye on it because things do happen in the background, and because it is a fast-moving industry, and we will get to the point where we sleeve power from one site to the other, so you are using the absolute maximum from your solar installation between the sites, which I do firmly believe will reduce your costs even further.
Excellent.
You know, and help from that side of things.
Well, we better leave it there, but thank you for all your help over the years, and I'm really excited about this. They're now selling power from one site to the other, so I think we'll start looking at that in the summer when our contract comes up. But yeah, it's been great talking to you. Cheers, Stephen. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.